Confirm identity, say that again, Reaper 1. The voice over the radio wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that didn't belong in a routine Delta briefing room, and for a fraction of a second, even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to hesitate, as if the walls themselves were listening. But 10 minutes earlier the room had been filled with a different kind of energy, sharp laughter echoing off steel cabinets and polished concrete floors, boots propped casually on tables, confidence worn like armor by men who believed they had already seen everything worth knowing. Staff Sergeant Cole Mercer leaned back in his chair, spinning a pen between his fingers as his gaze settled on the old man sitting alone near the edge of the room. The contrast was almost jarring. Mercer in full tactical gear, every line crisp, every patch precise, and the man in the corner wearing a faded jacket that looked older than most of the operators in the room, his posture relaxed but not careless. Hands resting quietly, eyes moving slowly, deliberately. Taking everything in without asking permission. You here for the museum tour? Mercer's voice cut across the room, drawing a few smirks from the others, the kind of casual jab that usually landed without resistance, but the old man didn't react, didn't even look up right away, and that was the first thing that felt off. Mercer leaned forward, elbows on his knees now, interest sharpening into something more pointed. Hey, I'm talking to you, he said, a little louder this time. A few heads turned, the room beginning to orbit around the interaction. The old man finally lifted his gaze, pale blue eyes steady, not challenging, not submissive, just present, like he had been waiting for the noise to settle before acknowledging it. Restricted area, Mercer added, standing now, boots hitting the floor with a deliberate thud that echoed just enough to command attention. You lost, or you just like wandering into places you don't belong? A couple of operators chuckled under their breath, one muttered something about retirees and wrong turns, but the old man remained still, his silence stretching just long enough to make the laughter feel slightly out of place. Mercer closed the distance, stopping a few feet away, close enough to assert control, far enough to avoid making it official. His eyes flicked down and caught something pinned loosely to the old man's chest, a small, worn comm tag, edges dulled, lettering almost erased by time. It didn't match anything in current rotation, didn't fit any system they use now. What's that? Mercer reached out without asking, fingers brushing the metal before pulling it free with a soft click, holding it up between two fingers like it weighed nothing. This some kind of souvenir, he said, turning it so the light caught the scratches. Looks like it came out of a scrapyard. A few more laughs, a few more eyes watching now, the room tightening around the moment. The old man's gaze followed the tag, not with panic, not even with irritation, but with a quiet focus that made Mercer hesitate for just a fraction of a second before he masked it with a smirk. You got clearance, you show it, Mercer went on, tapping the tag lightly against the table, letting it make a small metallic sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Otherwise, you walk. The old man finally spoke, his voice low, steady, like gravel worn smooth over time. You might want to put that back. No edge, no threat, just a statement, simple and complete. Mercer raised an eyebrow, amused more than anything. Or what? He asked, leaning in slightly, the room holding its breath without realizing it, and somewhere, unnoticed by most, a radio on the far side of the room gave a faint crackle, like something was waking up. The question did not land the way questions usually do. It did not echo with authority or challenge, it just sat there in the air, quiet and unfinished, and that was what unsettled Mercer more than anything else. Because he was used to reactions, to pushback or compliance. Not this steady absence of both. He tilted his head slightly, studying the old man as if trying to find the angle he had missed. You are in a Delta operations room, Mercer said, slower now, each word measured. That means you either belong here or you made a very bad decision. The men around him shifted subtly, the earlier laughter fading into something more attentive. Specialist Aaron Blake stood near the far wall, arms crossed, watching with a different kind of focus, not amused, not dismissive, just alert, because there was something about the old man's stillness that did not match the situation. It was not passive, it was controlled, like someone who had seen rooms far more dangerous than this and had already decided how this one would end. Mercer tapped the comm tag again against the table, the soft metallic click repeating, steady, almost rhythmic. Last chance, he said, identify yourself. The old man's eyes flicked briefly to the tag, then back to Mercer. No rush, no tension, you already have what you need, he replied, his voice low enough that Mercer had to lean in just a fraction to catch it, and that small movement, that unconscious adjustment, irritated him more than he expected. I have scrap metal. Mercer shot back, holding the tag up again, turning it toward The light, and a man who does not understand where he is. He glanced around, inviting agreement. A couple of operators nodded, but not as quickly as before. The energy had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Blake noticed it, the way conversations in the room had completely stopped, the way even the background noise of equipment seemed to fade, like everything was waiting. Blake's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the tag. Something about it pulling at the edge of his memory, not recognition. Exactly, more like a pattern that did not belong to anything current. He took a step toward the console on the side wall, casual enough not to draw attention, but deliberate enough to matter. Mercer exhaled sharply, impatience creeping back in. "You think silence is going to help you here?" he asked, and for the first time there was a hint of strain under the confidence, because the old man's calm was not breaking, it was not even bending. It was just there, steady and immovable. "No," the old man said, "I think you already made your choice." The words were simple, but they carried a finality that Mercer did not like. He set the tag down harder this time, the sound sharper, cutting through the room, and as it hit the surface, a faint crackle came again from the radio across the room, louder now, unmistakable. Blake reached it first, fingers moving quickly over the controls, his voice low as he keyed in a quiet query, feeding just enough information into the system to trigger a check without raising alarms. The response did not come immediately, but when it did, it was not automated, it was not routine. It was a live line opening somewhere above their level, somewhere that did not respond to standard requests. Blake's posture changed instantly, spine straightening, eyes flicking from the console to the old man and back again. The room did not notice yet, Mercer certainly did not. He was still focused on the man in front of him, still convinced this was his moment to assert control, but the air had already shifted, something unseen moving through channels he could not hear, and the next voice that came through the radio was not casual, not curious, it was sharp, controlled, and carrying a weight that did not belong to anyone in that room. "Repeat that identifier," it said, and Blake felt it before he understood it, a quiet certainty settling in his chest that whatever was about to happen, it was not going to go the way Mercer expected. Blake did not answer right away, his fingers hovering just above the console as the voice on the other end waited, not impatient, but expectant. The kind of silence that assumed compliance rather than demanded it. He swallowed once, then spoke carefully. "Unconfirmed tag recovered on site. Possible legacy comm identifier." He avoided looking at Mercer, but he could feel the shift behind him, the subtle tension tightening the room. The voice came back sharper this time. "Transmit visual." Blake hesitated for half a second, just enough to feel the weight of the decision, then angled the small camera toward the table where the worn tag rested, its scratched surface catching the overhead light in dull flashes. There was a pause, longer now, not technical, not delayed, but human, as if someone on the other end had gone completely still, and in that silence, something old seemed to surface, something that did not belong to standard protocol. Mercer exhaled through his nose, clearly losing patience. "What are you doing?" he asked, stepping closer to the console, his tone edged with irritation. "This is not a tech support issue." Blake did not respond, his attention locked on the faint audio feed, waiting, listening, because the air on that channel had changed. It no longer felt like a system, it felt like a memory being opened. Then finally, the voice returned, lower now, controlled in a way that suggested effort. "Where did you get that tag?" Blake answered without turning. It was on him, and for the first time since the call began, he glanced back toward the old man, who had not moved, not shifted, not even reached for the tag that had been taken from him. He simply sat there, watching, as if this exact moment had already been accounted for somewhere long ago. Mercer followed Blake's gaze, then scoffed lightly. "You are escalating this over scrap metal," he said, shaking his head, but the confidence in his voice did not land as cleanly as before. There was a slight hesitation now, a fraction of doubt that he could not fully hide. Blake turned back to the console as the voice came again, more urgent this time. "Confirm the individual, describe him." Blake's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the old man, taking in the details with a new awareness, the worn jacket, the steady posture, the eyes that did not flinch under scrutiny. Male. Late 70s or early 80s, no visible insignia, no active identification. He paused, then added quietly, "But he is not lost." Another silence followed, deeper this time, stretching just long enough to pull every eye in the room toward the radio without anyone consciously deciding to look. Even Mercer felt it now, the shift he could not explain, the sense that the situation had moved beyond him without permission. The voice returned, and this time it did not sound like it was speaking to Blake alone, it sounded like it was speaking into the room itself. "Do not remove that tag," it said, each word precise, controlled, "and do not let him leave." Mercer's jaw tightened slightly at that, instinctively bristling at the implication. "He is not going anywhere," he said, louder than necessary, reasserting control for the benefit of the room. But the radio cut through him before the words could settle. "You will hold position," the voice said, firmer now, carrying authority that did not need to be explained, "and you will wait." Blake felt his pulse pick up, not from fear, but from recognition, the kind that comes before understanding. He glanced once more at the old man, who finally shifted, just slightly, leaning forward enough to rest his forearms on his knees, his gaze moving from Mercer to Blake and then briefly to the radio, as if acknowledging it, not surprised, not concerned, just aware. And in that small movement, something clicked into place in Blake's mind, not a name, not yet, but a certainty, that whatever identity was tied to that worn piece of metal, it was not something that belonged to the past, it was something that still had reach, still had weight, and somewhere far above their level, someone had just decided to stand up because of it. The room did not return to normal after that. It could not, because something invisible had taken control of the pace, slowing everything down, stretching each second until it carried weight. Mercer felt it first in the silence between sounds, the way no one resumed talking, the way even small movement seemed deliberate now, measured, like no one wanted to be the first to misstep. He shifted his stance, rolling his shoulders slightly as if resetting himself. "You are all standing around because of a voice on a line," he said, trying to pull the moment back into something he understood, something he could control, but the words did not land with the same certainty as before. They felt thinner, like they were competing with something larger that had already settled over the room. Blake remained at the console, his posture straight, his attention split between the radio and the man behind him, every instinct telling him this was no longer a routine interruption. The voice on the line had not identified itself, but it had not needed to. Authority had been clear in the tone alone, the kind that did not repeat orders, only expectations. Mercer glanced at the tag again, still lying on the table where he had dropped it, its worn edges catching the overhead light in uneven reflections. It looked insignificant, almost forgotten, and yet everything in the room was now orbiting around it. He reached for it again, slower this time, less dismissive, turning it between his fingers as if trying to read something that was no longer there. The markings had faded beyond recognition. Whatever unit or designation it once carried was gone, erased by time, but the weight of it felt different now, not physical, but implied, like it was connected to something that had not faded at all. Behind him, one of the operators shifted his stance, boots scraping lightly against the floor, the sound sharp in the quiet, and then stillness returned, heavier than before. The old man had not moved much, but there was a subtle change, his posture slightly forward now, his presence more defined, not larger, not louder, just undeniable, like the room had finally adjusted to him instead of the other way around. His eyes moved once across the faces in front of him, not searching, not assessing, just acknowledging, and when they settled briefly on Mercer, there was no challenge in them, no resentment, just a calm certainty that made Mercer look away first without fully realizing it. The radio crackled again, sharper this time, and every head turned toward it without hesitation. "Confirm you have visual on the individual," the voice said, and now there was no mistaking it. This was not a background command, this was direct, focused. Blake answered immediately, affirmative, his voice steady but lower than before, instinctively matching the tone on the other end. There was a brief pause, then a second voice came through, quieter, but carrying even more weight, led behind the first, like a decision had just been escalated. "Hold your position," it said, slower, deliberate. "No one engages. No one dismisses." Mercer felt his jaw tighten again. The phrasing precise enough to feel personal, even though no name had been used. He exhaled slowly, forcing his shoulders to relax, but the control he had earlier was no longer his alone, it had been shared. Redistributed to a place he could not see. Blake's eyes flicked to the old man once more, and this time he noticed something he had missed before, not a detail, but an absence. There was no tension in him at all, no anticipation, no concern about what was happening around him, as if the outcome had already been decided long before anyone in this room had become part of it. And then, from somewhere down the corridor, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of a door opening with purpose, followed by measured footsteps moving closer, steady, unhurried, and carrying the kind of authority that did not need to announce itself, the kind that made people straighten before they even knew why. The footsteps did not rush, they did not need to, each one landed with a quiet certainty that carried farther than any shouted command ever could, and as they moved closer down the corridor, the room responded before anyone consciously decided to, shoulders straightened. Conversations that had not yet restarted remained silent. Even Mercer felt it, the subtle shift in his posture as his body reacted to something his mind had not fully processed yet. Blake stepped slightly away from the console, not retreating, just making space, his eyes fixed on the doorway as the sound approached, steady, unbroken, controlled, the kind of movement that belonged to someone who never needed to hurry because everything else would adjust instead. The door opened without hesitation, not slammed, not forced, just pushed with intent, and Colonel Richard Vaughn stepped inside, his presence immediate, not because he was loud or imposing in the physical sense, but because the room recognized him before he spoke, his uniform crisp, every line precise, his gaze sharp and direct as it swept once across the operators before settling, not on Mercer, not on the console, but on the old man seated in the corner, and in that moment, something subtle but undeniable happened. The dynamic of the room shifted again. This time completely. Mercer noticed it in the way Vaughn's expression did not carry confusion or irritation, but recognition, controlled and immediate, like a calculation that had already been completed. Mercer straightened instinctively, the earlier confidence now compressed into something more rigid, more careful. "Sir," he began, stepping forward half a pace, ready to explain, to frame the situation before it moved beyond him, but Vaughn raised a single hand, not sharply, not aggressively, just enough to stop the words before they formed, and Mercer stopped, the interruption landing heavier than any direct order. Vaughn's attention never left the old man, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in confirmation, like matching a memory to a reality that had taken longer than expected to appear. The room held its breath without realizing it, every operator watching, waiting, the earlier mockery now completely absent, replaced by attention that felt closer to anticipation than uncertainty. Blake stood still, his position forgotten, his focus locked entirely on what was about to unfold, because whatever authority had come through the radio, it had now entered the room in person. Vaughn took a step forward, then another, his pace measured, deliberate, stopping just a few feet from the old man, close enough to speak without raising his voice, and for the first time since he had entered, he spoke, his tone low, controlled, but carrying a weight that settled into every corner of the room. "You should have told them," he said, not as an accusation, not even as a question, but as a statement directed at the man who had said almost nothing since the moment this began. The old man looked up at him, calm, unchanged, as if this meeting was neither unexpected nor particularly significant to him. "They did not ask the right question," he replied, and the simplicity of the answer landed harder than anything louder could have. Vaughn exhaled quietly, a small release of tension that only someone watching closely would notice, and then, without turning, without raising his voice, he addressed the room. "Everyone stand by," he said, and the words carried an immediate effect, boots shifting into place, posture aligning without hesitation. Mercer felt it fully now, the complete loss of control over the situation he had initiated, his earlier certainty replaced by a sharp awareness that he had been operating with incomplete information, dangerously incomplete. Vaughn's gaze returned to the man in front of him, holding for a moment longer, and in that silence, there was no need for explanation, no need for rank to be stated, because whatever identity was about to be revealed, it was already understood by the only person in the room who mattered. And the rest were about to catch up. Vaughn did not rush the next moment, and that was what made it heavier, the pause, stretching just long enough for every person in the room to feel the weight of what had not yet been said. Mercer stood rigid now, his earlier posture replaced by something tighter, more controlled, his eyes flicking once toward the worn comm tag still resting on the table, then back to the two men in front of him, trying to connect the pieces that no longer fit the narrative he had built. Blake remained still, his breathing slow, measured, his attention locked entirely on Vaughn, because whatever came next would not be casual, it would define everything that had just happened. Vaughn finally shifted his gaze slightly, not away from the old man, but enough to acknowledge the room behind him, as if reminding everyone that they were still part of this, even if they no longer understood their role in it. "Return it," Vaughn said, his voice low, directed without looking, and Mercer did not hesitate this time. The hesitation from earlier gone, replaced by immediate compliance. He reached down, picked up the comm tag carefully, almost respectfully now, and stepped forward, extending it toward the old man, who accepted it with a simple movement, no ceremony, no acknowledgement beyond the act itself. his fingers closing around the worn metal as if it had never left his possession. Vaughn watched that exchange closely, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his stance, a straightening that carried more than posture, it carried recognition, and then he spoke again, this time clearly enough for every person in the room to hear. "You are looking at a designation that predates every system you are trained on," he said, his tone steady, precise, a call sign that does not appear in your databases because it was never meant to. The word settled over the operators, confusion flickering across a few faces, recognition beginning to form in others, the kind that starts as a rumor remembered too late. Mercer felt it as a tightening in his chest, not fear, but the sharp realization that he had stepped into something far outside his understanding. Vaughn turned slightly now, just enough to face the room more directly, his eyes moving across the operators one by one, not accusing, not judging, simply stating a truth that none of them could ignore. "There are names that are not used anymore," he continued, "not because they were forgotten, but because they were retired with the missions that carried them." Blake felt a quiet chill run through him at that, his mind reaching for fragments of stories he had heard but never verified, the kind that circulated quietly, never written down, never confirmed. And then Vaughn took a small step to the side, clearing the line between himself and the old man, making the focus unmistakable. "And there are names," he added, his voice lowering slightly, "that are not retired at all." The room held still, every movement paused, every breath measured. Mercer's eyes shifted again to the man in front of him, seeing him now not as an outsider, not as a mistake, but as something he had failed to recognize entirely. Vaughn looked back at the old man, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that bordered on respect, not exaggerated, not performative, just present, earned, and undeniable. "Sir," Vaughn said quietly, the word landing with more weight than any rank he could have spoken. "They did not know." The old man gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if that fact had never been in question, and then Vaughn turned his head slightly, just enough for his voice to carry clearly through the room. "Stand at attention," he said, and this time there was no hesitation, no delay. Boots aligned sharply against the floor, shoulders squared in unison, the shift immediate and complete, the room transforming in a single controlled movement. Mercer followed with the rest, his earlier stance replaced by precision, his eyes forward, but his awareness fixed on the man who had not moved at all, who had not needed to, and in that silence, Vaughn finally spoke the words that had been building since the moment he entered, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. "You are in the presence of Reaper 1, and the name did not echo, it did not need to, because the effect was immediate, total, and irreversible." The room did not react with noise, it reacted with stillness, the kind that comes when every assumption you had is replaced in an instant, and nothing needs to be said to understand it. The name did not need to be explained, it settled into the room like something that had always been there, just unseen, and for a long moment no one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the ventilation system pushing cool air across still shoulders and steady hands. Mercer felt it first in his chest, a tightening that was not fear but recognition arriving too late, the kind that rewrites everything you thought you understood about the last 10 minutes. His eyes remained forward, locked as protocol demanded, but his awareness shifted completely, every detail of the old man now reframed, the stillness that had seemed passive now read as control, the silence that had seemed empty now carried weight. Blake stood just off to the side, his posture perfect, but his mind moving quickly through fragments, stories half remembered from training rooms where instructors spoke carefully, never confirming, never denying, about operators who operated beyond documentation, names that were not written because writing them down would make them real in a way that systems could not contain. Vaughn did not repeat the call sign, he did not need to, the effect was already complete. Instead he took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space. An acknowledgement that the center of the room was no longer defined by rank alone. The old man remained seated for a moment longer, his hands resting lightly together. The comm tag now returned, held without display, without emphasis, as if it was simply a part of him that had never been separate. Then, slowly, he stood, the movement unhurried, controlled, and the room adjusted again without command, the line of operators holding steady, their alignment precise, but their attention sharpened, not out of obligation, but out of something closer to respect, the kind that does not need to be instructed. Mercer caught a brief glimpse of the man as he rose, the angle of his shoulders, the way his gaze moved across the room, not checking, not measuring, just acknowledging. And in that moment Mercer understood something he had missed entirely before. This was not someone who needed recognition, This was someone who had already lived beyond it. Vaughn's voice came again, quieter now, directed more to the room than to any individual. There are protocols you follow because they are written, he said, and there are others you follow because you understand why they exist. No one responded. No one needed to. The statement landed exactly where it needed to. Blake felt it settle into his own thinking, a recalibration. Happening in real time, the kind that does not erase mistakes but reframes them. The old man stepped forward then, just a single step, closing the distance to the table where he had been sitting, his hand brushing the surface lightly as if marking the end of something that had never needed to begin. His eyes moved once more across the room, pausing briefly on Mercer, not with judgment, not with reprimand, but with a quiet acknowledgment that carried more weight than either. Mercer held that look for a fraction of a second before returning his gaze forward, the lesson understood without being spoken. The old man then turned slightly toward Vaughn, giving a small nod, not formal, not ceremonial, just enough to signal that whatever needed to happen had already happened. Vaughn returned the nod with the same economy of movement, the exchange silent but complete, and then, without announcement, without instruction, the old man began to walk toward the door. He stepped steady, unhurried. The same measured pace that had defined him from the moment he entered. The room did not break formation. No one moved to follow. No one spoke. They simply held their positions as he passed, the space parting without effort, and as he reached the doorway, he paused for the briefest moment, not turning back, just standing there as if listening to something only he could hear, and then he continued on, disappearing into the corridor with the same quiet presence he had arrived with, leaving behind a room that understood, finally, that some identities do not need to be proven, they only need to be recognized. The door did not close loudly behind him. It did not need to. The soft click as it settled into place carried more finality than any command that had been given in the room, and for several seconds after he was gone, no one moved. The formation held as if the moment itself had not yet been dismissed. Mercer felt the weight of it linger, not just in the room, but in himself, a quiet pressure that forced him to replay everything that had just happened, every word, every gesture, every assumption that now felt incomplete. Vaughn remained where he was, his posture still composed, but his focus no longer fixed on the doorway. Instead he turned slowly back toward the operators, his gaze moving across them with measured precision, not searching for fault, not calling anyone out, but making something very clear without needing to say it directly. Blake was the first to shift slightly, not breaking formation, but adjusting just enough to signal awareness, his mind already processing what this meant beyond the moment. How something that had seemed so ordinary could shift so completely with a single piece of information. Vaughn took a step forward, then another, returning to the center of the room, the authority he carried now grounded not just in rank, but in context. At ease, he said, and the release came in unison, shoulders lowering, boots adjusting, but the room did not return to its earlier state. The energy had changed too much for that. Mercer exhaled slowly, rolling tension out of his shoulders. But he did not look away from Vaughn. He could not yet. Vaughn stopped in front of the table where the comm tag had been, his eyes resting on the empty surface for a moment before he spoke again. What you just witnessed, he said, his voice even, is not something you will find in your briefings or your manuals. The operators listened without interruption, the earlier casual posture gone, replaced by a focus that was sharper, more deliberate. Blake felt it in the way no one shifted unnecessarily, no one spoke out of turn. Vaughn continued, there are operations that do not get recorded the way you expect. And there are people who move through those operations without ever being fully documented. Mercer swallowed once, the words aligning with something he had dismissed earlier, something he now understood he should not have. Vaughn's gaze settled briefly on him, not accusatory, but direct enough to carry meaning. Confidence is expected in this room, Vaughn said, but assumption is not. The distinction landed cleanly, sharper than any reprimand could have been. Mercer gave a small, controlled nod, the acknowledgment silent but complete. Blake glanced once toward the doorway again, half expecting something more, but the corridor beyond remained still, empty, as if nothing unusual had passed through it at all. Vaughn let the silence settle for a moment before adding, you do not need to know everything, he said, but you do need to recognize when you are looking at something you have not been trained to understand. The room absorbed that without response, each operator internalizing it in their own way, the lesson not loud, not dramatic, but precise. Vaughn stepped back slightly, his role in the moment shifting from intervention to closure. This does not leave this room, he added, his tone firm, not as a warning, but as a standard, not the name, not the presence, not the details. There was no hesitation in the quiet acknowledgement that followed. No one questioned it, no one needed clarification. Mercer felt the final piece settle into place, not just what had happened, but what it meant, the boundaries of what he knew, and what existed beyond it. Vaughn gave a small nod, signaling the end of the moment. And just like that, the room began to move again, slowly at first, controlled, conversations returning in low voices, equipment humming back into focus, but nothing felt the same, because something had shifted permanently, not in the environment, but in how they saw it, and as Mercer turned slightly, his eyes caught the faint reflection of himself in the polished surface of the table, and for the first time since the old man had entered, he did not see certainty looking back at him, he saw understanding beginning to take its place. The room moved again, but not the way it had before. The laughter did not return. The casual edge that once filled the space had been replaced with something quieter, something more deliberate. Mercer found himself standing where he had been earlier, but it no longer felt like the same place, the same table, the same air. Even the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed different now, like everything had been recalibrated by a presence that had already left. He glanced once toward the doorway, not expecting to see anything, but still unable to ignore it. As if part of him was waiting for confirmation that the moment had truly passed, Blake leaned lightly against the console, not out of fatigue, but out of thought, his eyes distant for a second before refocusing, the pieces settling into place one by one, not answers exactly, but understanding. Vaughn remained near the center, watching without interrupting, allowing the room to absorb what it needed to absorb, because some lessons were not taught, they were realized. Mercer exhaled slowly and stepped forward, his movement measured, controlled, stopping near the edge of the table where the comm tag had rested just minutes ago. He placed his hand lightly against the surface, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm, grounding himself in something physical while everything else shifted internally. "Sir," he said finally, his voice lower now, not uncertain, but different. "Permission to ask a question." Vaughn looked at him for a moment, then gave a small nod, granting it without comment. Mercer paused briefly, choosing his words with more care than he had earlier. "How do we recognize something like that before it gets to this point?" The question hung in the air, not defensive, not challenging, but honest. Vaughn considered it, not rushing the answer, because the weight of it deserved more than a quick response. "You do not always recognize it," Vaughn said, his voice steady, "and that is the point." Mercer absorbed that, his brow tightening slightly, but he did not interrupt. Vaughn continued, "You learn to listen to what does not fit, not just what does. You pay attention to the silence, to the details that do not match your expectations." Blake nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding that now in a way he had not before. Vaughn's gaze moved briefly between them, ensuring the message settled. "And when you are not sure," he added, "you slow down instead of pushing forward." The simplicity of it made it sharper, because it removed the excuse of complexity. Mercer gave a small nod, the lesson landing fully this time, not as correction, but as adjustment, something he would carry forward whether he intended to or not. Vaughn stepped back slightly, signaling the end of the conversation without dismissing its importance. The room continued to return to motion, quiet voices, controlled movement, but every action now carried a trace of what had just happened, not heavy, not overwhelming, just present, like a line that had been drawn where none had existed before. Blake glanced once more at the console, the radio now silent, as if it had never spoken, but he knew better, they all did. Mercer straightened, his posture settling into something more grounded, less performative, his earlier confidence replaced not by doubt, but by awareness. And as he turned back toward his team, his voice carried a different tone, still firm, still clear, but measured. "Back to work," he said, and this time, it was not about control, it was about continuity. The room responded, not because it had to, but because it understood, and somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the systems and the structure, a man walked unseen, unchanged, carrying nothing that needed to be proven, leaving behind nothing that needed to be explained.